Hello, and welcome to the Echo Research Podcast, a new series of insightful conversations between global leaders in communications and reputation strategy. I'm Sandra McLeod, founder and chief executive of Echo Research. For over 30 years, we've been making a tangible difference to clients through our stakeholder and media and social listening research. We also run the annual Britain's Most Admired Companies study. We provide board-ready reputational insights to help improve decision-making and performance. Our motto is aim for better. Through relationships we built over the last 3 decades, we are in a unique position to help share trends, benchmarking, and best practice. So our new podcast series taps into this rich vein of knowledge and experience to provide valuable insights in or around communications and reputation. So with that, discussing Society is Communications, 2 award-winning and highly respected international academics and practitioners on either side of the world explore the role and challenges for communicators today. I'm delighted to welcome Professor Anne Gregory on Echo's advisory board and Professor Jim Macnamara at the University of Technology, Sydney, both global lions in the communications industry, on this very straight talking podcast. Tune in for 40 minutes of great insight, clear perspectives, and practical guidance on 3 major areas: going beyond purpose, the responsibility in AI and big data, and the problems of evaluation. With that, I'll hand over to Professor Anne Gregory.
Jim, a huge topic to discuss today, the purpose and future contribution of public relations and communication. Clearly, communication is there to help organizations meet their objectives, but you and I believe that the overall purpose of communication is to ensure that organizations remain legitimate. So that's a big question. So to try and focus our discussion, we're going to look at 3 topics that demonstrate what we mean. The first is, what is it that's required for an organization to remain legitimate? Second, how do we adjust to a world that's being shaped and driven by AI increasingly? And third, how we can change the way we approach communication so that we can demonstrate the contribution of communication. So Jim, what's required of organizations to gain, retain, and grow their legitimacy?
It is a very important question, and about how organizations need to behave today. I always love to go back to John Dewey's famous statement that society is communication, that actually if you don't have public communication, you can't form a society. And so that's an interesting basis that talks about the importance of communication. But then all through the 20th century, we had an approach in business. And if we quote another famous person, Milton Friedman, who was famous for saying that the only responsibility of business was to make profits for their shareholders. And that was a mantra that was used a lot through the late 19th and into the 20th century. And that is actually no longer accepted by society. People today, for various reasons, governments can't collect enough tax revenue to provide all the services they provide. Corporations have become so big that they are bigger than many governments. And so with that growth and with that permission to operate that we've given in a private enterprise society, particularly in democratic democracies, democratic capitalist societies, corporations have to take on additional responsibilities. And we now have, we've had corporate social responsibility as one attempt at that. We've now got businesses talking about social purpose. And so it's not that we're saying we expect businesses won't make money. They can certainly continue to operate and make profit. That is a legitimate reason, but they have to do more. Businesses, to be legitimate and to continue to have permission to operate today, need to be able to contribute to their stakeholders and make some contribution to society. And the very minimum, I would say, they can't do damage to society and the environment, which some do, but ideally a business to be sustainable, to be acceptable in our critical society, a business and an organization is going to have to do more than just not do damage and do more than just serve its shareholders. It is going to have to do things for its customers, its other stakeholders, and its society.
Okay, and I know that one of the things that you talk about a lot, Jim, is authenticity. What do you mean by that?
Well, if I could use an Australian expression, and I'm not sure I'm allowed to, but I'd say it's avoiding bullshit. Now, authenticity is a word that on its own is not enough, because to be authentic is to be true to what you are and what you say. But of course, Vladimir Putin is probably authentic, and we don't necessarily like what he's doing right now, if we wanted to use a contemporary example. So generally, we use the term authenticity as part of the equation, that we need people to not lie, to not pretend, to not say one thing and do the other. But I guess, and I know you talk about this, Anne, we need to be more than authentic. We also need to be good. We need our authenticity to be translated to good benefits to people, rather than simply, one could argue that during World War II, some of the leaders of the start of the war were authentic, but we're not talking about that kind of authenticity. It's authenticity plus contribution to society, good intention. I think there's a lot more to it.
Yeah, I'd like to pick you up on that point, being good, Jim, because it sounds a bit soppy in a way, doesn't it? Be a good organization. But I think what we're saying here really is organizations need to behave in a way that gain trust. And we've seen trust absolutely draining away in governments, organizations, in every sector of society. And if you think about what's required to gain trust, then it adds to that authenticity piece. And if we think about the characteristics of people who we regard as good, as being trustworthy, it's probably a good starting place for us to think about how organizations gain trust as well. And for me, it comes down to three things. I've got a little mnemonic about it. I call it ICE. It's integrity. We've got to act with integrity, doing the right thing. And sometimes that means putting other people's interests first. Competence. So there's no good being an organization that doesn't deliver, that's incompetent and is not able to deliver on the promise made to stakeholders, to its customers, etc. And also empathy. So good people understand other people, and good organizations have an empathy for the stakeholders that they have and an empathy for what's going on in society. So if you like, the DNA, their character, then they also put these things into action. So it's the way they behave. So have they got a values base? We talk a lot about organizational values. They're there very often when you're walking through the front door, but do they actually act to them? And that solid values base that is put into action has to go on top of just sort of declarations of integrity and competence and empathy. And for me, it's about actions, not just words. People think about communication being actions second, words first, but it's actions that actually people interpret. So, and the way they behave, are they open? Are they collaborative? Are they committed? So if something goes wrong, are they going to still stay committed to you? Do you feel that you've got somebody who's there, who's going to be trustworthy and is going to be there in the tough times as well? And I think communication professionals at the heart of this, what sounds soft, but it's very tough, because it's about decision making ultimately. How organizations make their decisions right at the top, because those decisions are communicated and they are the organizational narrative. They are the story. The company's decisions are the story that they tell. And if they're not seen to have integrity, if they're not seen to demonstrate commitment and things like that, then those decisions won't be supported. It's as simple as that. And our job really is to be the guardian there, holding up the reality of what those decisions in words and actions mean and how they're perceived by others. Are they seen to be good? So that doing good piece, it's been around for a long while, Jim. And I'm just wondering how you think, given that CSI has been around for a long time as well, how we might sort of think about expressions of good in a different way now, because we're in a different world, aren't we?
Yes, I think we have to do a lot more, and I guess I'm critical when it comes to concepts like CSR, because corporate social responsibility started out with good intentions, but unfortunately, in reality, in many cases, it came to be a company perhaps sponsoring a sports club or a local community and doing something to win some support, but not actually carrying those values into their major operations. They kept on doing whatever they were doing before, whether it was cutting down forests or mistreating their employees. And CSR has begun to get a bad name, I believe. And of course, social purpose has become one of the more recent buzzwords. And Larry Fink has famously come out with statements that even private and public corporations have a social purpose, which in itself is a very pleasing and a very radical statement. But of course, many corporations are now what we call purpose washing, where they are trying to look like they are contributing to some social purpose and not doing it. I kind of like your ICE formula. I think it's a good one. To me, minimum things are competence. Because if an organization is not competent, then why would anyone trust it or even buy its products? But also ethics is very, very important. And if we look at the recent trust barometer, the Edelman Trust Barometer, there's a lot of lessons there for management in senior management in organizations as well as communicators, because the two things that strike me in the 2021 and 2022 research is that the public's expectations of business has actually grown. It's not declined. 20 years ago, people thought government was primarily responsible to provide services and support for people, and business did business. Today, when the question was asked, who do you expect to be able to solve society's problems? People voted number one, business. And that's understandable, because business has become big. Corporations now are bigger than many governments, as I said before. And so people have an expectation of business that they're no longer these small enterprises that are there for a handful of shareholders. They are major institutions in our society, and they carry a responsibility with that. And they have the resources to be able to do that. So there is a high expectation, but as you pointed out, the other big question in trust barometers, or you can go to Pew Research Center data, is that the public trust in government and in business and in media is all very low. Now, that is a real challenge for both senior management, and it's a very, very big challenge for communicators.
I think it was really interesting, Jim, when the COVID outbreak started, how companies then interacted with their stakeholders, for me, was a turning point really in whether or not we trusted them. Because who did they put first? And I guess like me, you got lots of emails and communication from companies saying, with business continuity, you can still buy our X and our Y and our Z. And I contrasted that with Unilever. And their first pronouncements about COVID was, we've got a whole group of small suppliers, and we're going to put some money aside, 50 million euros, I think it was, to make sure that they are able to continue in business. We make hand sanitizer. We're going to give billions of pounds worth of hand sanitizer and other sort of cleansing products to countries because we know that they're going to have tough access to it. And they position themselves in that values base. We're a big organization with a contribution to make, and they're doing all sorts of things now, like divesting themselves of products with palm oil, etc., etc. And that company is doing brilliantly. And it's doing brilliantly because it's doing good. It's not doing good so it can do brilliantly. It's doing brilliantly because the CEO decided that they needed to be a good organization. So this is not soft stuff, is it, Jim? It is about attracting support. It is about being a favored employer. It is about having a good culture in the organization where people can put their hand up and say, I work for this company and they are brilliant. And I think at the end of the day, it makes leadership of those companies easier. You know, because you haven't got the world against you and you've got your employees with you. What more would you want as a leader? And you're going to make money. So these things are so intertwined, aren't they?
I think that's a very important point, and that it comes down that we've as communicators, we do have to get across to management that this is not about doing good for some normative, wishy-washy, we all want to be nice type thing. Yes, I think ideologically, there's an argument we should do good. But at a practical level, what you're pointing out is something that's proving very true on many, many organizations. Organizations that do good, that stand by their stakeholders, stand by their customers. Yes, there's a cost involved, and that's a fact. But that cost is usually returned multiple times in the success of the organization. So if we think about sustainability, and sustainability is not only about environmental sustainability, heaven knows we all want environmental sustainability, but businesses want business sustainability. And I go back to triple line bottom thinking, which was first of all thought about in the 1990s. Businesses still not quite realize that if you really want sustainability, you have to think longer term, you have to invest, and you have to do good, and it will come back to you. You will be sustainable longer term. And we're seeing some examples of that, as you point out. So I think it's important to get across that this is not some naive academic theory that we're presenting. It's that the public's expectations are increasing. The public's access to media and communication is exponentially increasing. They have a voice. The public's choices are increasing around the world. And if an organization wants to be sustainable, it can no longer hide behind a handful of journalists or a corporate PR department. It's very much on display. And if it makes the right kind of investments that not only benefit shareholders for a short-term return on a quarterly balance sheet, but investments that benefit the shareholders, the other stakeholders, society, they will be sustainable, and they'll make a hell of a lot more money in the long term, and we'll actually have a better life and a better planet to live on.
So Jim, our next topic for discussion is big data and AI. And I'm just wondering if I ought to give a quick definition of both so we're all on the same page before we start. So AI is a variety of computing technologies that look like human intelligence. They can be quite simple AI systems, for example, robots who are assembling dishwashers, but computers are now capable of deep learning, where they can teach themselves specific tasks and can get very good at it. So for example, we've got driverless cars, and they can recognize cats. We don't have to show them every variety of cat, but they understand what cattishness is, and therefore they will not run into cats because they understand the nature of a cat, and they've learned that themselves. So big data are huge data sets, and these data sets are beyond the capacity of traditional databases. And there's three things that categorize big data. First of all, they have high volumes of data, lots of it, millions of pieces of data in some cases. So high volume, high velocity, that is, it can be processed incredibly quickly, often in real time, and also high variety. So they can draw into their data set all sorts of things, from sensors on fridges to social media to video, audio, etc. Bring that together for analysis. So we know, Jim, that data-infused and AI-infused tools are being used in all kinds of organizational processes. When we order stuff online, we can be offered all sorts of choices, and it's tailored to our needs because AI has discovered what people like me and you prefer and offer it to us. And right now we've even got HR departments who are sifting through job applicants to choose through AI tools the right people for certain jobs. And I had a brilliant example of business decision making using big data the other day. So, you know, UPS, who deliver our parcels. So UPS lorries in the States turn right, and they only ever turn right. And they turn right because they don't have to cut across traffic in junctions. They don't have to wait for anybody who might be going across a junction turning if they're trying to turn left. And even though it might be longer in distance, UPS saves time, money, hold-ups because there may be accidents at junctions, etc., etc. And big data work that out for their senior leaders. So, and we know in our world, Jim, world of communication, we've got everything in our little world, including the research we do, identifying stakeholders, what their behaviors are, predicting future behavior, deciding what channels and influencers are most persuasive, and even generating the content, bots generating content for us these days, and of course evaluation as well. And so these AI systems know more about us than we know about ourselves. And there must be positives and negatives associated with that. Can you tell us a few of those, Jim?
I think we have to start when we look at big data and we look at AI, artificial intelligence. I think we have to acknowledge that there's some enormous benefits from this technology. And there's so many, I mean, most of us can't imagine driving our car today without a sat-nav system in the car that has all this data that it's accessing and can map our favorite routes and remember where our home is and so forth. And so having acknowledged that, but a couple of issues that I think are really important. And the first one is about big data. When we talk about big data, often it's not a single data set, and very rarely it is. Typically what happens is there are data sets all over the world. Every organization has different data sets. And where we run into trouble is that many of those data sets, if not most of them, are quite legitimately held. Someone may know your age and what car you drive. Someone else may have your health information. Someone else may know your social media habits. But they may be individually legal. But what happens with big data is that certain organizations can integrate and pull together multiple data sets. So even though the original data was legitimately held, suddenly when you bring together and combine, let's say not a few, but 100, 200, 2,000 databases, you suddenly have massive amounts of information about a family and a person. You can know almost everything about their medical history, their personal history, their bank accounts, etc. And so what that means is that there's nothing wrong intrinsically with big data, but there needs to be ethical rules around what data you can combine and how you can use that data. And that was the issue that Cambridge Analytica and Facebook got into trouble with, is that a lot of the data was legitimately held, but it was then combined and they purchased additional data and used it in ways that it was never given for. Algorithms are a very common element within AI. Almost everything today uses algorithms. Even finding my way to an address in my car, I'm using an algorithm. The problem with algorithms is, again, where the data comes from. And one of my questions is, and I've actually broken open a number of algorithms to have a look at them, and they usually combine multiple data sets. But sometimes the people who've built the algorithm have purchased the data from various sources. And I recently opened an algorithm and had a close look at it, where it was combining contemporary information with data from databases that were up to 15 years old. Now, you can suddenly get incredible errors occurring, where imagine if someone was using data about you from 15 years ago, let's say your financial position, with your wish to purchase a house today. And so we have big issues with data. It's not the data. We need the data. The data is information. The data is useful. We need better ethical guidelines and better standards around how we use that data. Sometimes it's intentional manipulation. Sometimes it's purely stupidity and accidental. The algorithm I saw, they combined data that ranged from 15 years old to 15 minutes old. How can you combine data sets that are so different and expect you're going to actually understand what a cat looks like? You're probably identifying a lion. I don't know. But so I think there's a lot of issues. We could talk forever about data, but I bring it back to the fact that humans, at the end of the day, make decisions. Algorithms inform us, and algorithms can make some very basic, well, I don't even think they make decisions. My algorithm, my car tells me to turn left. I don't have to turn left. I have the steering wheel in my hand. So my answer is, CEOs, communication directors, you have the steering wheel in your hand. Take responsibility. Listen to the data, but you have the steering wheel.
I think you make such an important point here about ethics, Jim. And my concern at the moment is who in our organisation takes that step back and monitors the overall governance and impact of all this big data and AI, this sort of it seems as if there's a great impetus, and that's been driven partly by COVID as well, to take it on board. It's the next big solution to businesses' problems. And I think there's some big questions for us in communications too, given what we know about stakeholders and how we could manipulate them without them even knowing, because we know so much about them. And I think that this question of governance is much bigger than, well, let's ask the IT specialists then. And it goes back really, I think, to asking the question about who's best placed to do that stand back and take on, if you like, that oversight role. And I'd argue very strongly it's the comms department. We know stakeholders best. We know how to engage with them in discussions about whether our organization should take on board AI systems. And yes, those discussions are happening, and I'll give an example in a minute. And we've often claimed that ethical guardian role. And somebody needs to ask those questions that you were asking just now. Well, right from the beginning, why are we commissioning these systems? What's in them? What are the algorithms doing? What's the nature of the insights they're generating? Is there any biases in them? Are we being transparent that we're using algorithms? And can we explain what's going on in those algorithms? And then what about the impacts of AI? And we're talking here about society being reshaped. And I know that's a big change, but it is. And it doesn't take an idiot to just look around to see how now it is impossible to talk to a human being in a lot of organizations. You've got to talk to a bot. And those bots are collecting data from you every time you speak to them. And it is shaping how that organization will then interact with you. It's changing the nature of work, who works, how we work with machines. And, and the questions about, and are these things creating harm or good, are huge questions. And where are we leading to in society and in organizations? And these are questions now that are increasingly being asked by stakeholders. And I'm going to give you a quick example, as I promised I would. Vodafone is a huge telecoms company here in the UK and throughout Europe and throughout the world, actually. And they are setting out in very transparent terms their principles for deploying AI publicly. And they've got a number of key elements to them, quite short, and I'll just read them to you. Transparency and accountability. Customers and employees are informed when they are communicating with an AI system. Ethics and fairness, a commitment to the ethical development of AI. Preservation of privacy and security of all individuals who use our systems. Human rights, diversity and inclusivity. Respecting international human rights standards and best practice to ensure diversity, accessibility and inclusivity. So we don't get driverless cars running into black people because it's white people who program them, and all the video footage that they've been trained on represents mainly white people. There's no bias in our AI systems. Maximizing the benefits of AI while managing the disruption of its implementation. Because, work will change and some people will lose their jobs. So being a responsible employer and ensuring AI systems are human-centric. And I think that's a good starting point, really. And I wonder how many organizations are having those transparent conversations with people. So I've emphasized the negative a bit there, Jim, but there are huge positives as well, aren't there?
There are huge positives, but quite rightly, Anne, you're raising the issue of governance. When it comes to new technologies. And there is no question, all through human society, we will take advantage of new technologies, whether it's the invention of the wheel or whatever. One of the challenges we face, though, in an organization, and perhaps I'm subjective in some of these comments, but I think, first of all, that you ask who has to take responsibility. Well, CEOs, ministers, congressmen, senators, the head of the organization, there is no question. First and foremost, they have to accept a large part of the responsibility for ensuring we use systems ethically and appropriately. The trouble we have, though, is in organizations, leadership is distributed. So we turn to the IT people. Well, the role of IT is to do whatever is capable, what the best they can achieve. That's not their job, is not to weigh up the ethics. Their job is to do what is possible with the latest technology. We could turn to the lawyers, but the lawyer's job is to tell us what is within the current law, not necessarily to advise us on reputation or other issues. We can turn to the marketing staff, but the marketing staff's job is to sell more product and more services. And so we have this issue that in a distributed leadership organization, you asked a very tough question: who can stand up and give advice? Now, I'd like to be able to say that the senior communication person could do that. And really, they should be able to do that for many reasons, because they are involved in social and market research. They are talking to stakeholders. They're concerned about reputation. But I think that then opens up the big challenge of training and education. Does our profession have the qualifications to work at that level? And right now, I'm reading many surveys that show that communication people lack skills in AI, lack skills in big data, and even lacks training in ethics. And so that is a big, big challenge, because right now you could say that some organizations are sailing into a wild new future, almost rudderless, that each department will do. It will maximize the opportunities. It will stay within the law. It'll sell as many products as it can, but who is able to step back and give strategic advice? And that could be management consultancy firms. It could be communication consultants. But from what I see in the research, I think we have to significantly develop the capabilities and the understanding so that there is a resource within organizations who can guide them on the broader principles.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. And actually, at the end of the day, it's everybody's responsibility, isn't it? And no one person will have all the wisdom to do this, but somebody has to ask those questions. And as you say, if we're talking about organizational legitimacy, reputation, that's often, those questions come from communication directors. You wanted to do this with AI? How is that going to land with the people this is going to impact on? You know, these are questions that we're responsible for. We won't have all the answers, of course, but I'm thinking into the future as well, Jim, and particularly in our world of communication. We're looking at a very different world, I think. We've got user-machine interfaces that are getting very, very powerful. We know now we're moving into the world of VR and AR. These technologies are embracing all our senses. Every surface, the desk that I'm sitting at now, has the potential actually to have sensors in it. And these systems will genuinely, I've used the phrase before, but they will know more about us than we know about ourselves, from our emotional reactions when we're interacting with them, to what resonates with us when we're talking. And the implications of this are huge, you know, that we'll be able to engage with people as communicators and organizations as employers of communicators. We'll be able to engage with people and know exactly what is required to make them act in a particular way. And the sort of division between reality and the virtual, those divisions are beginning to fall away anyway. And as we get closer and closer to machines and they become part of our reality, you know, the governance around that, huge questions to be asked as well. So I think there are questions about regulation and lobbying on this. But for me, what's really important is that we begin to start that public debate. And I think that's part of our role as well, as communicators, to bring onto the public agenda those things that are heading our way. And we need to be able to make positive decisions about where we go, rather than drifting along and going into a world that we're not really in control of, and not deliberately making positive decisions about these are the restrictions we want to put around these technologies, because if we go down that route, we're going to harm our society. These are the things, these fantastic things that allow us, you know, to help older people not be lonely because they've got somebody to talk to identify where diseases are going to spring out across the world. These are the things that we want these technologies really to engage in.
I think there's a couple of issues there, and that I still think we need to focus on the human. We've had literature about the machine for well over a century. People have been frightened of machines taking over our lives for well over 100 years with each wave of technology. And certainly machines can do many things, but I think what we still often forget is at the end of the day, the human is making interpretations and making decisions what to do with those machines. And this is where I think we live in a world where the communication particularly sits within the disciplines of arts and humanities. And we've disciplined our world so that science and technology studied in one part of universities and the world, and arts and humanities and social sciences are studied elsewhere. And I think it's very, very important, and it's a role for academics as well as industry to integrate those two, that when we develop technology, we need to have people with humanities and social sciences backgrounds sitting there as well, thinking about the human side, because these are human decisions and humans have agency. Machines calculate statistical probability. They know the statistical probability of what I'll probably do tomorrow morning. But in the end, I will decide what I do tomorrow morning. And I actually may get up and do something different. And I think it's a broader disciplinary debate, but I think we have made a mistake in allowing technology and engineering in those fields to develop in isolation, and then having arts and social sciences and humanities as a separate field. And I know some universities are starting to bring them together and to say that every technology, every engineering development, every medical development, we want social scientists, we want humanities people involved in that process. And so there's a lot of responsibility for industry, and there's a lot of responsibility back on researchers and academics as well.
Couldn't agree more on that. I think there is something about these multidisciplinary teams, so we get out of our own sort of obsessions, because we have pathways of thinking. It's inevitable, you know, because we're specialists. And if we can put together those multiple disciplined teams, then we'll have better decision making. And I absolutely agree with you. How many times have I heard, though, the phrase, the evidence tells us, and therefore our decision has to be driven by this? And I think with AI and big data, we have to ask that question: where has the evidence come from? What's in that algorithm? You know, and what you were saying is what sort of data were collected? Was it biased? Are there any mistakes here? And how does this click in and relate to the reality that we know? Because again, you sometimes see people sit back and say, really, is that what they're, oh, wow, that's an insight. Oh, I never know that. And then they give in rather than saying, I need to question this. I need to know what's behind this. And as you say, the human remaining in control must be a key element here. So our last area for discussion is evaluation. And Jim, I know in our field in communication, this is a perennial topic. We go round and round the wheel on this one. So for you, what are the issues in evaluation, and where are we now?
As you say, Anne, we've been talking about evaluation of communication intensively for 40 to 50 years, and we're still debating the same old issues. I think we've covered a lot of ground, and we could talk forever about evaluation. But I think there's two really important points that I draw out of having worked in the field for about 40 years, both as a practitioner and as a researcher. The first one, the first pitfall that we're suffering is that most evaluation is organization centric. And by that, I mean organizations are focused on measuring what they do. How many press releases they put out, how much media publicity they got, what impressions they got, et cetera, et cetera. And at the end of the day, they are finding out what they've done, but actually, really, they need to be understanding what people are thinking of them, what trust levels are. And so it just as an example, and this is a fact because I've just analyzed 15 different models of evaluation. And do you know that not one of them, they all have the organization at the top. Not one of them has stakeholders or publics even in the model. It's just measuring information flow from the organization. That is a problem. We are just focused on ourselves and measuring what we are saying. So I talk about it as the architecture of speaking. The second issue is related to that, and it comes out of the fact that what we are measuring, it's actually been written about in 1985 called substitution error. And almost everywhere we go and look at evaluation reports, we see reports that tell us how many impressions we got, how much media publicity we got, how many website visits we got. And those, in terms of program theory and program logic models, are called outputs. They are what we put out. They are not outcomes. And so if we are to add value to an organization, we have to be deciding what were the outcomes of our communication. And I use a very simple analogy to business, that when we are producing and measuring outputs, we are a cost center. We're spending their money. We're publishing things, producing things. The only way we can become a value-adding center is by understanding the outcomes. What is the changes of perception, the changes of intention, the changes of awareness, the changes of attitude, the changes of behavior? And if you look at the entire industry, and I even challenge my colleagues in the Association for Measurement and Evaluation, is that most of the work is still focused on media metrics, which is really only an output. And so I see this, we need to get beyond organization centricity. We need to really become audience focused, and we need to get beyond substitution error, where we're only measuring our outputs and saying, wow, look at how much work I did. Look at how much stuff I put out. You know, and Alex Aiken at the Government Communication Service in London calls it SOS, sending out stuff. And too much of our industry is about sending out stuff. And what we've really got to focus on is listening and understanding audiences and what are their attitudes, their needs, their perceptions. And then as communicators, how can we influence that? How are we changing that and influencing those attitudes? So those to me are my two perennial bugbears, if you like, about evaluation.
And just picking up on your point about the organisation centricity of evaluation, it seems to me, Jim, then we need to do much more in developing methodologies that allow us to look from the other side of the telescope then, from the stakeholders' perspective. Because right at the beginning of our chat, we were talking about securing organisational legitimacy. So if we're not asking those people, is my organisation legitimate, then we're sort of missing the point a bit here, aren't we? And so, you know, maybe we should ask questions. If we're talking about society and stakeholders, making organisations and legitimate, we need to be asking questions of society. Are we acting legitimately in your view? Are we making the contribution you'd expect us to? What about our contribution to the environment and to local communities? Do you think we're on the right lines here? What are we doing about sharing our plans for the future? And do they feel a part of that? You know, and do we actually decide how we're going to evaluate this together? So we have a common view of what our end objective should be. And what are the big agenda items that you think our organisation should be focusing on, and help us determine what a legitimate contribution might be from us, from an organisation of our type, our size, our location. And in the stakeholders, again, you know, we never ask, how do you want to work with us? It's always assumed that, you know, we can go to them time and time again. I call it the ask question. You know, do we ever audit how many times we ask stuff of our stakeholders? And audit how many times we do something because it's the right thing to do, or just because we want to partner with them responsibly? So do we ever ask them, do you feel that we're committed to you? Do we ask them, do we add value to you? Do we ask them, out of all the organizations that you work with, would we be one of the ones that you put top of the list and say, I've got to work with them because they're brilliant, and I feel that we're actually building a future together with that organization? You know, do we collaborate? Are we open with them? Are we transparent with them? It goes back to the ethics question, doesn't it? And it seems to me, actually, again, might be accused of, well, very naive and wishy-washy, but this is not ignoring the bottom line. This is securing it. And it's your point about sustainability, Jim, isn't it? You know, if we want to be sustainable as organizations into the future, those stakeholders and society have got to stick their hands up and say, that company is brilliant. I want to work with them. I want to buy their products. I want to go and actually be an employee. with that organization, employer of choice, those sorts of things. So it seems that maybe we're moving away from just evaluating communications, Jim, to measuring and evaluating the performance of whole organizations. Do you think that's where we're going?
Well, many parts of the organization, of course, do their own evaluation, and some is very specialized, and IT departments and so forth. But it's probably too complicated to talk about in a single podcast. But something I've done controversially recently is organizations often use what's called the program logic model, which is basically the inputs, the activities, the outputs, and the outcomes and impact that the organization wants to achieve. But we only ever use that, and it's all one-way traffic, the output and the impact we want to achieve. I've written a meta model where I flipped it upside down and put another logic model underneath it, traveling the other way, because our stakeholders and society have inputs, and they are carrying out activities, lobbying, mobilizing, writing complaints, writing submissions to government, and they have their own separate set of goals and impacts and outcomes that they want to achieve. And what is really interesting is when you look at this, and I call it a meta model, is when you look at what the organization's aiming to achieve and what the stakeholders are aiming to achieve, they're often the opposite. And so the only way you're going to be sustainable is if somehow you can bring those two models together. So the meta model says we really have to look at both ends of the scale, which is kind of what you're saying. And I've tried to draw it visually to say, instead of just focusing on what we put out and what we want to achieve as an organization, we've got to remember that our audiences are not silent. They are speaking out. They are lobbying. They are rallying. They are mobilizing. They're lodging submissions. They are lobbying government. They're doing all the same things the organization's doing, with a different set of goals. We need to get together and be talking to them, because actually they may achieve their goals and we won't. And so it's a very exciting area where I think there's a lot more work can be done. And we're now referring to measurement, evaluation, and learning, the learning process that you can gain by engaging with stakeholders and trying to find mutual ground, because sustainability is only achievable in the middle ground, where both the organization succeeds and stakeholders and society succeeds and government succeeds. If someone's losing out, there is always going to be social conflict, and there's always going to be disruption.
It seems to me as well that we've had a past obsession with measuring things and metrics, so how many press releases did we put out, and how many clicks did we get through on the website, and how many readers were there on this? And those are the things that we've focused on, Jim, in the past. And as channels proliferate, we're going to get more and more opportunities to do all those countings of things. And it seems to me that organizational leaders, they want to know that their money has been spent efficiently, so that has its place. But actually what they really want is information for the future and answering those big questions, which is, what does society require of us? You and I together have generated another model which takes us away from program logic to a series of key questions. Are we focused on the big things? Is this organization behaving in a way that's going to secure the support of its stakeholders? Those are the big questions. Not how many press releases did we put out yesterday and the readership that it got, and is this group of stakeholders working with us in a way that demonstrates that they're happy with us or likely to oppose us? And what's the trend of their relationship with us? Is it towards a positive, or are we doing things now that are beginning to frustrate them and annoy them? And as you say, that aligning of the two agendas between the organization and its stakeholders requires conversations. And that's not something that most traditional evaluation models have actually focused on. It's looked to the past, and it's looked at all the things we do, the stuff we put out, not to the impact or the outcomes of the stuff that we put out. Neither has it looked to the future. What do we need to do now, and what do we need to do next, which is what I think business leaders are most interested in.
And that was my point about the focus on outputs. You're quite right. And I mean, interestingly, we've been measuring press releases, I think, since about 1904, I think, was the first press clipping agency in New York City. So that tells you how long counting press clips and audience reach has been published since about 1920. So these are really old metrics. And here we are in 2022, and we're still doing a lot of the same thing. And to me, that's where we need to get way beyond that. And the problem is with digitalization, there's ever more of those kind of metrics that are easy and cheap to get. So we can use Google Analytics and get all our website visits and all our video views, and we can put a whole pile of data on the page. But it actually means nothing unless people have engaged with it, unless it's actually changed awareness or attitudes or their behavior in some way. And that's the missing part. And I think that is something that is holding the public relations and the communication industry back a long way, is that they are still focused on, it is important to measure outputs. Of course, if we're not doing the outputs, we're never going to get outcomes. It's an important part, but it's I call it halfway to the journey. It's halfway to where we want to be. We've got to be able to tell organization what outcomes we're achieving. And then, as you rightly say, what insights does that give us for the future? What's working? What's not working? Where are the opportunities? What could we do better? How can we build better relationships? And that's where real value comes to the organization.